I'm going to try and cover two things. Up until now, one of the things that I've been kind of focusing on with my teachings has been what's wrong with where we're at right now and why things need to change. I've been talking a lot about politics, and I've been talking a lot about the economics of the system. What I'd like to do is go back and examine the concept of justice, and then maybe do a little bit on history of revolution, and then why they failed and how they've succeeded. So let me just start with the justice thing and see how this goes. Any analysis of justice kind of has to start in one place, and that one place does such a decent job of starting the discussion. That's essentially where I'm going to go. And that one place is Plato's Republic. The book was written about 2,400 years ago, and it was actually a play. Plato wrote plays, which I've always found very delightful. And it was meant to be performed. It was meant to be a dialogue. And the play starts out in a really interesting way in the sense that Plato always used lots of symbolism. And what happens is there's a group of men, including Socrates, on the way to the Piraeus, which is a port city that Athens conquered so that they could have access to the sea. And they're going because an older man has invited them over for dinner and to talk philosophy. And that older man is named Cephalus. And Cephalus in Greek means head. And so Cephalus brings them over, he sits them down, he serves them drinks, he stands up and he says, "I'm an old man and it's already reached my bedtime, so I'm leaving. But carry on the discussion without me." And so, one of the hypotheses about why Plato starts the play off that way is he's saying that really any discussion about justice that we need to have needs to not include the older people because they're just not capable of it. And we need to just jettison them and then move on. So he gets rid of the old man in the beginning of the story. The story progresses a little bit. There's a little bit of background stuff that's built up, and we end up with this guy Thrasymachus asking Socrates, "What is justice?" And Socrates responds to Thrasymachus by saying, "What do you think justice is?" And Thrasymachus says, "Well, I know what justice is because I'm a soldier. Justice is might makes right. That because I have the military ability to subjugate you, I will create justice." And Socrates goes, "Oh, very good, that's a wonderful answer." And then he proceeds to ask Thrasymachus a series of questions. And in the process of asking these questions, Socrates' goal is to actually get Thrasymachus to prove Thrasymachus wrong. So Socrates isn't going to go, "Oh my God, you're wrong, and this is why." He's just going to keep asking questions and getting Thrasymachus' answers and go, "Oh, that's very interesting. So then if that's true, then..." And then ask him another question, and then Thrasymachus will answer that. And by the time they're finished, Thrasymachus admits that there is no correlation between a person being powerful and a person being just. Therefore, the mighty don't always do the right thing. Therefore, the might doesn't always make right. And as a result, he admits basically that he's wrong. But Socrates isn't the kind of person that just enjoys having his opponent admit he's wrong. He really likes to humiliate them a little bit. So just as Thrasymachus is kind of admitting he's done and surrendering the debate, Socrates goes, "Oh, Thrasymachus, I hope I haven't offended you. I'm an old man." That's the weird thing about Cephalus leaving. Socrates is kind of in the years himself. But anyway, I'm an old man and I'm weak, and you're a young, powerful warrior, and you could just beat me right here, right now. Please don't beat me. The reason is because if Thrasymachus was right to begin with, he would just grab Socrates and proceed to beat him, and then might would make right, and then he could prove that might made right. But of course, Thrasymachus knows that he can't prove it by beating him, and so in a huff, he walks out of the room, he leaves the room. At which point, there are two characters in the play that are actually in real life Plato's brothers. And it was a way Plato could insert himself into into plays without inserting himself into the play. Because he seemed to have a real problem making himself into a character. And the two brothers are Glaucon and Adeimantus. And one of the two brothers says, "Okay, I buy that. I buy that might doesn't always make right. However, having said that, I'm pretty sure in order to have people act justly, there has to be some sort of state-like authority that comes along and forces people to act justly. For example, if somebody finds a purse and it's filled with money, and you open it up and you find the ID and you know who it belongs to, the just person is the idiot, because the just person is going to return the purse. But the smart person is going to return the purse after taking the money first. And Socrates then ends up going, no, you've got this backwards. And the reason essentially boils down to the relationship between the individuals and the community. So Socrates says, look, if you take the money out of the purse, you helped yourself, of course. But how about the person that you returned the purse to? What did you do to them? And of course you wounded that person. Well, is that person not a member of the community? And the answer is of course. And then you wounded a member of the community. When a member of the community is wounded, is the community therefore not wounded? Yes. And if the community is wounded, are not all its members therefore wounded? And the answer, of course, is yes. Therefore, the person stealing the money out of the purse and not returning the purse full of money is actually wounding themselves, because they're hurting the community. So, okay. And they kind of accept that because it's pretty reasonable. And Socrates then goes on to say, it's actually the just person who's the wise person, because the just person realizes that they keep the community stronger by acting in just way. So, at that point, one of the brothers goes, okay, how about this? Somebody commits a wrong against me, then a just society is a society that uses force to commit a wrong against that person. And then, so it's the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of argument. And Socrates basically says, no, that doesn't make any sense. That at the end of the day, that type of a society is just doing two wrongs, that it's committing two acts of injustice. And that the second act of injustice does nothing to actually fix the first act of injustice. So you're actually just hurting the community more. And so at the end of the day, all you've done is reduce the community, which means you've reduced the victim, right? Because you've now actually injured the victim, because the victim is a member of the community where the other person was injured. And so they dismiss all the conventional definitions of justice, essentially. This notion that might makes right, this notion that the state creates justice, and then also this third notion that justice is really just an act of vengeance. And Socrates basically goes on to say that only a really barbaric and immature society that lacked wisdom would ever equate vengeance with justice, which is something to ponder for a while. So then they're like, okay, Socrates, you've blown apart all our definitions for justice. You need to give us something. You need to now tell us what you think justice is. You've been avoiding it the whole conversation, and it's just not fair. And so Socrates actually says, justice is fitness, which of course brings to mind in our society physical fitness, and we go and we lift weights, or we go running, or we do some yoga. And he did mean that, but only in part. And that would be maybe a third of the equation, that people do need to be physically fit. The Greeks believed that a healthy mind existed in a healthy body, and that a healthy body existed because there was a healthy mind, and that if you had one without the other, it was completely, utterly useless. So the original Greek schools were called gymnasium, which we say in English gymnasium. And of course the gymnasium is where we go and do physical exercise. In Germany, the gymnasium is their equivalent of the high school that's aimed towards creating college students, because Germany has a three-tiered high school system. There's the people who are going to be the workers, there's the people who are going to be the technicians and the repair people, and then there's the highest level, those guys are going to go on to go to the university, and they go to the gymnasium. So somehow the old Greek term gymnasium got split, the Germans got the mind part and we got the body part. But of course, the Greeks would have thought that both were ridiculous, that you should do both. So, that's part of the whole definition of fitness. That Socrates believed you need to be mentally fit and physically fit, but within the capacity of your body and your mind. That is to say, he didn't think everybody needed to be able to run the New York Marathon. He thought you should take your body to its maximum physical ability, and you should do the same with your mind. You should take it to your maximum mental ability. And of course, he also meant that you should be, more or less sane in the process, not just smart. So this is the basis for his definition of fitness, but it's only about 2/3 of it. The last third was that we should all be fit within our community. He said, the analogies he's using was a machine or a beehive, and that everybody kind of knows their role and knows their place, and everybody kind of has a different assignment. And his thinking went along these lines, that everybody, he uses the analogy of metals. I'm not going to do that here, but everybody effectively is born with a certain set of attributes, a certain innate nature that makes them designed to do some task. They're either very physically oriented, or they're very mentally oriented, or there's some combination. They might be good at abstract thinking or detailed thinking. They might be good at, memorizing, or they might be good at thinking out of the box. Everybody has different talents, and they're combined in different ways. So that some people are, by their very nature, born to be great brain surgeons. And some people are born to be great ditch diggers. And some people are born to repair things. And that a just society is a society that helps every individual find that thing that they will be great at, and then allows them the opportunity to go do that thing for their profession. So Socrates' justice definition effectively was around work. He said, if you can get people to work at the job they were born to do, and give them all the skills that are required, that you will create a just society, because you will get a bunch of side effects of that. For one thing, if people are doing what they were meant to do, they will be excellent at it. And the acts that they do will be, as a result, excellent, which will improve the community. But there's a few other really positive side effects. If you're excellent at something, it's entirely possible that you're happy doing it. And happy people, of course, make for a better community. And it's also entirely possible that you will take pride in your work. And people who take pride in their work will naturally be a little bit more self-confident, and they will probably also be a little bit more happy. But of course, how do you get there? How do you create that perfect society where everybody fits? Another analogy he did was organs of the body, and that each organ has a completely different role, but together they make the body healthy. And that when one organ starts to go out, the body itself starts to go out. And so every part of the community is essentially critical to sustaining the community. At the end of the day, the training system that they're thinking of, that Plato is thinking of, because at some level the Republic is a work of fiction. There's no doubt that some of these ideas probably did come from Socrates, because Plato borrowed very heavily from his teacher. But at the end of the day, we don't know what Socrates really believed, because Socrates never wrote anything. So when we talk about Plato or Socrates, the two are very blurred together. I mean, there's a little bit of separation, because there was another student named Xenophon who also wrote about Socrates, and he contradicts a lot of what Plato says. So Plato was probably looking at it through, rose-colored glasses, and Xenophon might have been a little bit more, a little bit less idealistic. Having said that, Plato is 100 times the philosopher of Xenophon, and so that's why nobody remembers Xenophon. Although Xenophon's great fun to read, so he writes adventure stories effectively, because he participated in a couple of really crazy adventures that were like these amazing harrowing experiences, and then he wrote about them later. The way you're going to create this society has a lot to do with what Plato thinks the ideal way to raise children is, and it was based on Sparta. Plato loved Sparta. He actually really despised Athens and the Athenian democracy, but he loved Sparta and its order and its structure. And he uses the analogy of the beehive. So he's obviously attached to this hierarchical idea. And in Sparta, the Spartiate, the 10% of Sparta that actually ruled Sparta, 90% were effectively, the subjects of Sparta, and there was 10% who were in charge. The Spartiate, when you were born, you were taken immediately from your mom. You were raised in a community. The community was extraordinarily egalitarian. Different women would breastfeed you so that you would get the nutrients that you needed, but then you would never develop a one-on-one attachment with any given person. Nobody was allowed in the Spartiate to own their own personal property. You owned everything communally. They were a total commune. And then the women Spartiate and the male Spartiate, from a very early age, 4 or 5, began training. And you began training in common in the same place, and you got the same education. Now that education was designed to turn the Spartiate into an amazing combat force. That education men and women would train in the use of weapons. They would learn a little bit of poetry. They would learn a little bit of history. They would learn just enough math, just enough culture, so that they would be incredibly good warriors. Because that's the only thing the Spartiate did. When you were born, by the way, if you weren't a healthy-looking baby, they disposed of you. You wouldn't be raised. You would just, they would take you out in the woods and they would leave you behind, and good luck. It's not probably going to work out well for you. Because the Spartiate were actually participating in a eugenics project to create the best warriors that they could, and they were trying to create, their whole society was based around this. And Plato loved it, not necessarily just because it was this warrior society, but also because it was extraordinarily egalitarian. And he realized that in order to create a truly just society, you needed to have a truly egalitarian education system. Now, the earlier premise that fitness is you'd find that thing you were meant to do and then you do it, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to be a warrior, because some people are going to be really terrible at it. They're not going to have the mental or physical abilities. They're not going to have the aggression that's necessary, right? The Spartiate, by the way, believed that women should be trained to be warriors, so that if the men were ever defeated and Sparta was going to be invaded, Lacedaemonia was the name of the place they lived in. If Lacedaemonia was ever going to be invaded, that the Spartiate women would then take up the weapons and they would fight to the death. It was supposed to be all or nothing. There was supposed to be complete wipeout, and they never were defeated that way. They ended up conquering Athens, and then Athenian culture corrupted Sparta from within, and then Sparta collapsed. So it was never actually conquered from outside, it was conquered from inside by accidentally conquering a society that was so corrupt, it actually infused Sparta with that corruption and destroyed it. What you're talking about is sort of the Hegelian model, which is that there's a thesis and an antithesis. It's the dialectic. And in Hegel's sense of it, what happens is there's this conflict between two sides, and as time goes by, the two sides become more and more similar until the conflict is resolved, and by that point, you are like your enemy. I mean, that was part of the Nazi ideology. I think it was Himmler who said, as in the final month that the war was going on, it doesn't matter who wins at this point, we've made them so much like us, we have effectively prevailed. I think we can see that sometimes reflected in the way the police overreact to demonstrators. For example, the UC Davis event, UC Berkeley last week, or the Occupy movement breakdowns that were happening all last week in Denver, Portland, New York, and Oakland, of course. So yeah, we definitely have that. I mean, there's definitely a little bit of that. And right now, the United States military uses the World War II German helmet, and the German military uses the World War II US helmet. So there's this incredible irony in that we've swapped helmets. And so you can find these types of at least symbolic patterns everywhere. By the way, Hegel got the idea for the dialectic from Plato's plays, because that's what's going on, is there's this conflict in the dialogue between Socrates and then some other poor bastard who he's going to humiliate and have him prove himself wrong in the process, which is one of the reasons why Socrates is ultimately killed, is because the Athenians get sick of him because he's constantly criticizing them and humiliating them, and so they give him the death penalty and make him kill himself, which is got to be the most cruel way to die. Although apparently he did it willingly, at least according to Xenophon and Plato. So we've got this Spartiate, the Spartiate that is gonna, they're gonna make all these crazy sacrifices. They're gonna sacrifice wealth, they're gonna sacrifice their freedom, and they're gonna get this really incredibly egalitarian education that doesn't discriminate on the basis of women or where you were born. Well, you have to be born as a Spartiate. But as long as you're a Spartiate, it doesn't discriminate on any other basis. Plato ultimately says that if you're going to create this type of a just society, it must effectively have no classism, no sexism, and no racism. Because if you have, for example, sexism, you already eliminated half the potential justice. If you have classism, you eliminate 99% of the potential justice, right? If you have racism, you're eliminating, at least in the United States, probably around 1/3 of the potential justice. And so at the end of the day, to create a truly just society where everybody has access to it, you can't do that. An unjust society in Plato's mind would be a society where the person who was born to be a brain surgeon ended up becoming a garbage collector, and the guy who was born to be a garbage collector becomes president of the United States of America.
This has happened.
I think it has happened before, I'm pretty sure. And of course, our society reflects both Plato's or Socrates' the failure to achieve Socrates' justice, but also our attempt to achieve Socrates' justice. Right? It's our society has both, totally entwined in it. And the fact that we have made enormous strides in terms of sexism and racism and classism. The reality is that's why the SAT, that's the role the SAT played, was that it kind of flattened out the playing field. Until there was an SAT, the only way you were going to get into college essentially boiled down to your ability to have connections. You had to be related to somebody. And what the SAT did was it said, no, you can also be smart. And that's enough to get you in, right? Having said that, we still have a very powerful legacy system, especially in the private schools, but even in the state-run schools. I mean, the fact that George Bush Jr. got a bachelor's degree from Yale and an MBA from Harvard completely repudiates the credibility of the Ivy League schools. They are forever humiliated and cannot possibly ever claim that they have any type of academic standard. I mean, it's just impossible. Okay, so we've got this definition of justice. Now, the problem with this definition of justice, and there is a really, really big problem with this definition of justice, is the fact that we've gone through the Industrial Revolution. And we're now actually well on the other side because the United States is actually deindustrialized. And at this point, we don't have the type of job variability that you would have had in, say, a medieval society. That is to say, we don't have shoemakers anymore. We don't even have car makers anymore. We don't have carpenters anymore so much. What we've done is we've turned into a society where we have assembly lines, we have mass production systems, where no individual is actually making anything. They're participating with other individuals in the process of making something. So my shoes were made in a sweatshop somewhere in the third world, where there were a bunch of probably 10, 11-year-old children, and each one did a different part. There was one kid working on attaching the sole. There was another kid punching holes in the shoe for the laces. Right? There was a kid doing a different part. So no one kid actually made my shoes. The problem is in this society is what are the job options that you have? If you were to go back 100 years ago, your job option was work in a factory. 100 years ago, you're working 10 hours a day, 6.5 days a week. You didn't have any benefits. There was no vacation. There was no sick time. There was no job safety. Today, there are no factories, so that's not really much of an option either. So your options are things like service industry, which is what the society we've created is. We've become a consumer-based service industry society that essentially lives on its inheritance. That we had gone through this industrial age, built up all this capital, all this wealth, all this military power. We did it in part by going to the third world and plundering it. We have this myth that somehow we're a very peaceful society. The reality is, since 1887, we've probably been in 140 military expeditions, which means that we're averaging slightly more than one a year. And some of those have been just absurd. Like we invaded Nicaragua 7 times over the course of that time. I think we've invaded Guatemala 8 times over the course of that time. We regularly go in, we invade a country, and in the case of Guatemala and Nicaragua, what are we invading it for? Does anybody know? No, coffee would almost make sense. Bananas. In the case of both Nicaragua and Guatemala, the people had actually taken over parts of the agricultural system. And so they were asking for some sort of fair compensation. So the price of bananas was going up. And as a result, we would then go and we would invade that country, sometimes overthrow the democratic government if they happen to have one, and then we would install a puppet regime that ended up getting the title Banana Republic. And then we make fun of Latin American countries for having banana republics, even though we're the guys who created the banana republics to begin with. And we talk about how they're unstable because they're ruled by dictators, even though we're the guys going in there and installing the dictators. And then we would pull out. And that was neo-colonialism. It was very different than what the British were doing, which is they would go into a country, they would invade it, they would plant their flag, and they would stay, and they would leave a permanent military and cultural legacy. They would, if you look at India, one of the reasons why we have outsourcing going to India is because India is now an English-speaking country. Like there is a very permanent, tangible cultural legacy that Great Britain has left behind in India. English is the language they use to communicate with each other because they're a country with 60 major languages, and so that's a result of the English conquest. If the English hadn't, they'd probably be using Urdu or some variation of Urdu to do that, right? So in the case of the United States, we just would go in, we would overthrow the government, install our puppet, change the price of bananas, pull out, wait a few years, the feisty Nicaraguans and Guatemalans would get all uppity, they'd jack the price of bananas up, we'd go in, we'd butcher a few more, we'd go in with the Marines, of course, and we would repeat. And in the process, we helped develop the US economy. We made ourselves rich. The wealth that we experience here in the United States today is in part a result of the plunder that we've done to the rest of the third world. We have extracted these goods, we've made profits off of them, and we're even doing that today. The way that actually ends up translating, strangely enough, is Latin America now is broken up into two blocks. There's the EU-oriented bloc and there's the United States-oriented bloc, and there's actually a banana trade war going on right now between the United States and the European Union, and it's been going on for over a decade over these two blocks of banana exporters. So we're still kind of conducting this. So there's still this trickle-up effect of us extracting wealth from the third world. However, having said that, we don't do anything anymore organically to really create our own wealth. In the United States, our number one exports are corn, right? We're still an agriculture superpower. We produce movies, we produce music, we produce weapons, although we're now starting to move a lot of our weapon manufacturing to China and other countries, and pornography. And so the opportunities for exporting, like we're still number one in pornography, in case you were worried. I believe Russia and the Netherlands are really pushing that, and they're trying to catch up with us, but I think we're still there. Just sort of another fun stat on that. For the first time since the internet, the number one activity on the internet in 2010 wasn't pornography. So what was it? It was social networking. So Facebook beat pornography in 2010.
Darn, no.
Don't get me wrong, I think pornography is still number two.
It so is.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a problem, and the problem is, let's say you were meant to do something. You were meant to be a shoemaker, or you had all the attributes that meant that you should be a cabinet maker, or you should be a furniture maker. In our society, trying to make a living doing those things, making shoes, isn't very practical, because there's shoes being made in factories. Even if you took the sweatshop element out, brought the shoemaking factories back to the United States, even if you didn't have the shoes being produced on unfair wages with unfair working conditions, and you paid people real wages, and you ended up charging people $100 or $200 for a pair of shoes, which would be a real cost as opposed to the cheaper costs that we pay. Even if you did that, at the end of the day, if you personally made your own shoes, you wouldn't be able to do this. I actually met a cordwainer, a shoemaker, who makes his own shoes, but he only makes it for people who can't go into a store and buy them because their feet are really big or they're oddly shaped. And he's charging $2,000-$3,000 a pair, right? So there's no way to be competitive in the environment that we live in today. So we have a problem, and the problem is, how do you go from, because I bet I partly sold you on Plato's definition through Socrates of justice. It kind of makes sense that everybody is sort of meant to do something. And at the end of the day, that's what college does. You're forced to take a course in this and a course in that, and you build up your core curriculum, and then you go off and you specialize. The thinking in the college system is that in the process of taking all these different classes, at some point you're going to go, that's what I was meant to do for the rest of my life. And then you're supposed to pursue that and become that thing. Now, of course, your parents will screw you up because your parents are telling you become a doctor or become a lawyer because you can make tons of money. But really, that's not what you're supposed to do in college. You're supposed to find your life's calling. Now, having said that, now you've got your degree in whatever, English or political science or anthropology. Now what do you do? Well, you can go become a manager at a store, or you can, or you can go get a government job. Like there is no such thing as anthropologists unless you get a PhD and end up teaching at a university. But how many of those exist in the entire United States? Maybe 5,000-6,000 anthropologists with PhDs running around at universities teaching. I think political scientists, we probably run around 10,000. So if you've got your political science degree, the odds are you're not going to become a political scientist. We live in a society where you might find your calling, but you're probably never going to be able to actually execute it, because there just aren't those types of jobs anymore, if there ever really were. Because even though I kind of hinted that maybe you had a better opportunity 1,000 years ago, that's if you were meant to be a blacksmith, or a weaponsmith, or a shoemaker, or a furniture maker. Those opportunities kind of existed, but the vast majority of people were jammed into becoming peasants. The vast majority of people didn't have a choice, and they were forced to become peasants. So this seems to be this constant, like if you were born to the Spartiate, you're going to become a warrior, even if you were meant to be something else. Now, yeah, of course, you could dabble a little bit, but they're not going to let you be an actual carpenter if you're in the Spartiate, because they really want you to do the war. The Helots were allowed to be whatever they wanted to. So the Helots had actually extraordinary, but the Helots were second-class citizens. They were the people conquered by the Spartiate. The Helots ended up actually having a lot more freedom than the Spartiate. So in our society, how do you find that justice? How do you create that moment of justice, that moment of space, where you do the thing you were meant to do, where you do the thing you were born to do? And it's made worse because we are still a very classist society. So for example, if I had two people, one person, she has unbelievable hand-eye coordination, right? Just crazy hand-eye coordination. She has dexterity like you've probably never seen before. She's also really good at abstract thinking, let's say. So she can kind of model things, and she's really good at three-dimensional abstract thinking. So she can do one of those tests where, they give you a drawing and they go, if this was a three-dimensional object, rotate it 90 degrees and tell me what it looks like. And then she's also really good at memorization, let's say, and we'll even give her unbelievably stamina. She can stand for 12 hours at a time with it really not phasing her. She's capable of doing all these things. And we'll make her black from Third Ward Houston and really poor. All right? Now, let me grab a kid and we'll make him a boy, and we'll make him white, and we'll put him in Lake Travis, right, in the Lake Travis area, and we'll give him a rich family, and he'll go to a decent elementary, middle, and high school, and he'll probably end up going to UT. And he's got okay stamina, and he's got okay hand-eye coordination, and he's got good memory skills, but not unbelievable, and he's got good abstraction skills, but it's nothing to write home about. And who's going to become the brain surgeon? He is. So we have two problems. One, there really isn't the variety of the jobs that were out there that aren't out there anymore, although there are new jobs that weren't out there before, like if you're computer oriented, the sky's the limit. And then, but I mean, how many people were born to stare at a screen that slowly blinds you? And then on top of that, we still have a classist, sexist, racist society that hasn't quite gotten past it. Having said that, there's probably no period in time where that girl had a better chance. You know what I'm saying? Like that's what I'm saying, that we've got both running at the same time. That girl has a chance, but if you were to go back 60 years ago, she had no chance. She wasn't even in the running. But now she does. And if she applies herself and gets really goddamn lucky, she just might get there. It's unlikely. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on her, but it is within the realm of possibility. So this is a question that's actually been struggled on by especially socialists who made it their project in the 19th century and into the 20th century and now the 21st century, how to create a just society in an industrial age, or even in a post-industrial age, which we are going through in the United States. It's important to remember we're in a post-industrial age only in the first world. The third world is still in a fully industrial age. Where do you think all the stuff is coming from? Right? The stuff that's around us, that we live with, that we benefit from, was made in the third world by people who were paid less than what they were worth, and then it was brought here. The classic example of this, and it blows my brains, is the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Martin Luther King Memorial was designed by a Chinese artist, and it was made by the Chinese right? So a Chinese artist, Chinese laborers, using rock from China. So, I mean, it's just so strange to me that while we couldn't find an American rock laying around somewhere, we couldn't find an American artist or an African American artist. Like, why not have given this project over to, you know what I mean? Like, this is the level at which we have gotten attached to this idea that we are just not going to do anything. Now, part of the problem is us. Part of the problem is that we've got it in our society's mind, in our collective mind, that we shouldn't have to work hard. We've become used to this. We live like privileged folk. We live, even though we're not the top 1%, we still live very, very good. You can be poor in the United States and still have it fairly well. Now, obviously in the last 4 years, we've seen that unravel a little bit because we're running around 18% unemployment. Now, some of you are saying, last time I heard it was 9%, how is it that it's 18%? Well, it's because of the way the government calculates unemployment. The 9% is the number of people who are collecting unemployment benefits. Now, the government admits that for the first time, there are actually more people not collecting unemployment benefits that are collecting it who are actually unemployed. The number is 52%. Well, if 52% are not collecting unemployment benefits but are actually unemployed, and then we've got this 9% that are unemployed because the only people who are counted are the unemployed who are collecting benefits, it means that the number is double. So we know that the actual unemployment rate is right around 18%. It's a little bit less, but it's around 18%. And then when you throw in underemployment, it's way more, because the underemployment isn't even calculated at all, even though we are now in the last 4 years been experiencing very serious underemployment. And by underemployment, I mean that, you know, you have a person who is making, you know, 250 grand a year, they lose their job, and now they're working 2 part-time jobs and making 40 grand a year, but they probably have 50 grand a year worth of expenses that they had accumulated, so they're having to let go of all their material wealth. Don't get me wrong, I'm not crying, but it is a serious reduction in the quality of life that people are experiencing, and it is causing very serious discontent. And part of the reason for that is the accumulation of wealth at the top. We are living through an age where we are becoming increasingly less and less egalitarian. By design, we've actually been undergoing a project to create a less egalitarian society now for the last 38 years. Sometime around 1973 is when the switch was thrown that flipped us from a society that was becoming increasingly more egalitarian to a society where the difference between the bottom and the top was increasing. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, in 1973, 8% of the United States' annual income was earned by the top 1%. So I'll just say it again, 8% was earned by the top 1%. In 2010, 40% of the United States' income was earned by the top 1%. And it's because we've been systematically creating a situation where this can happen, cutting taxes to the wealthy. In the Eisenhower administration, the top tax bracket was hit at 90%. So if you just got $1 million into that top tax bracket, you took home $100,000. Right? It was literally 90%. By the way, Eisenhower was a conservative Republican. He wasn't crazy conservative. He was a moderate conservative, but he was definitely a Republican. Today, that top tax bracket is 35%. So, right, I mean, this is a very dramatic change. That means if you made that $1 million, you're going to take home $650,000 of it. In European states, what was that? Only. Yeah, I know, cry. So, my heart breaks when I think about it. And they want it reduced more. That's the craziness of it. In the process, we've also deregulated the economy. Bill Clinton destroyed social welfare as we knew it. Created a new system that is a completely different system. And we still call it social welfare, but it really is something new. I mean, we've completely redone the way we allow the distribution of wealth to be undertaken in the United States, and we've allowed it to accumulate at the top in a greater way than we had before. And part of the reason is because we've deindustrialized. In the act of deindustrializing, the jobs went away. And when the jobs went away, people who had been working in these jobs for years that had been unionized and well organized had to go get jobs in new places. And those jobs were usually part-time, and creating unions meant that they would do things like close the store down, right? Whole Foods does that. When a store looks like it's about to unionize, they close it and just open a new one somewhere else. I mean, we've got tactics to deal with, this is great, better lighting, huh? But we've got all these tactics to deal with keeping the unions out, and as a result, we can keep the standard of pay and the work, the way people compete for wealth at a much lower level. Let me put it in a different way. If you were to go back to 40 years ago, and you were to go back to we don't really think of 1970 as the father knows best era anymore, right? That's 1960, but there's still a remnant of that society where you still have middle class, especially upper middle class, but also middle class families that are capable of sustaining a middle class lifestyle with one person working. We got, by 1970, 1973, we got pretty close to a 40-hour work week. I don't think we actually hit the 40-hour on average. I think it was like 41 or 40 hours and a half. But we got really close to it. Right now we're doing a 50-hour work week. It's pretty hard to imagine anybody but the upper middle class being able to sustain a middle class household without both people working. That is to say that, both people in that relationship, whatever that relationship, however it's configured, that both people we would expect to work to maintain that middle class lifestyle. Well, the average work week was 40 hours 40 years ago. It's now 50 hours, but you have two people doing it instead of one person doing it. So it means that the average household in the United States, to maintain the same lifestyle that we had 40 years ago, is spending 100 hours a week doing it. So another way to look at it is our standard of living has dropped. We've lost 60% of it, effectively, because we have to work 2.5 times more to get to that same level. And we're going to continue to see that. Another way that's reflected, and I don't mean to get into all these stats, I'll shift over to revolution as promised earlier, but I want to kind of create where we are. Another way that's reflected is the average 65-year-old's household today is worth, I think it was 57 times the value of the average 35-year-old's household today. But that doesn't really tell you anything other than, wow, 65-year-olds are really, really wealthy. What's really surprising about that stat is 10 years ago, that ratio was 1/4 that. In other words, that ratio is now 4 times worse than it was 10 years ago. The ratio 10 years ago is something like the 65-year-olds were 14 times wealthier than the 35-year-olds. And that number now has actually quadrupled in the last 10 years, which suggests that our standard of living continues to spiral downward. So, the good news is that we're getting poorer, and that we're going to have to start rethinking the way we do things, the way we spend, the way we consume, because we consume for the sake of consumption. It's the way our economy is designed. George Bush gets accused of going out after 9/11 and saying, do the patriotic thing, go shopping. He didn't actually say that, but he said something very similar to that. He said, our economy's in trouble, do something, go shopping, right?
I hate to interrupt, but I was just told there's this really bad storm going to be here about 7.
Okay.
And it's
If you
supposed
look
to
right
rain
down
and
there,
sleet.
it's about to hit.
Oh, wow, cool.
And yeah, it looks really dark.
It is really dark over there.
Just wanted to
Okay,
let
so what
you
time
guys-
is it now?
Like
It's
6.
like
Okay.
6 o'clock, maybe
Okay.
a little
Just wanted to
before.
let you guys know.
Thanks.
Oh,
Thanks, you.
there,
So, all right, so let me do the revolution part as promised. And then hopefully we can kind of contextualize it and bring it together. The first popular uprising that we know of, so the first recorded popular uprising actually took place in Egypt, and it took place in the Old Kingdom somewhere around 4,500 years ago. And the reason the uprising took place was because of a symbolic thing. It was, there might have been an economic problem, but we don't know because it's not recorded. But there was a symbolic problem. And the symbolic problem was that only Pharaoh went to heaven. And so people didn't like that. And so they rose up and they captured the capital of Egypt. It was Memphis. They captured Memphis and Memphis, Egypt. Tennessee wasn't where the capital of Egypt was at the time. They captured Memphis, but Memphis, Tennessee is named after Memphis, Egypt. They captured it, and they actually went and they grabbed a hold of the holy texts, which some were actually carved in stone, but some were written on papyrus, and they changed what the holy text said. And they made it so that everybody had access to heaven. And then the Pharaoh he regrouped his army, and they came back and he recaptured his capital, and he reasserted his authority. And so the first popular uprising, the first revolution in history, was defeated. And in many ways, every revolution kind of has been since. In many ways, I don't want to say that it's completely that way, but no revolution has ever created the state that it set out to create. That no revolution is really, well, except maybe the American Revolution. Because I have really bad news for people who think that the past was somehow better. I have a feeling that if Alexander Hamilton were around today, he would not only approve, but he would be like doing a dance. He would be just so excited. This is really what I meant. So this sort of naive thing that no, the founding fathers were these really great guys is probably a bad assessment. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some of them that might disapprove. Like, I'm pretty sure Thomas Jefferson would be pulling his hair out and screaming, "This is not what I wanted." But he already knew that back then. I mean, that's why he created the Democratic Republicans. He created the opposition party. He knew we were in trouble from the start. So we were, which is why Texas has cut him out of the Texas textbooks. Well, it's a lot of them. But actually what's funny is Texas has a lot less influence than it did 10 years ago, because now publishers are much more willing to customize textbooks to states, and states are much more capable of doing it. So Texas's influence is thankfully a little bit less diminished. Although every once in a while it looks like we might get a president from Texas, which makes me think that the rest of the country is incapable of learning a lesson. Let's start with the American Revolution and go over just briefly. First of all, the American Revolution started out as a commoners' revolution. It was an average, everyday Massachusetts person who took up arms against the British, not because they wanted independence from Great Britain and to create the United States of America, but because they were fighting for their English rights. And their English right they were upset about was promised to them in the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And the English Bill of Rights said that if you're taxed, you're due representation. And so, as a result, they were fighting for the representation in Parliament. The colonies had actually gone through a series of negotiations with the British after the 7 Years' War was over and before 1775, so over that 12-year span of time, begging the British, basically, to give us representation in Parliament. The last really good chance we had was done by Benjamin Franklin, and the Brits sent Benjamin Franklin back home empty-handed, which pissed him off, which turned him into a revolutionary because he felt like his pride was crushed, and he wanted to conduct an act of vengeance to get his personal feelings unhurt a little bit. In any case, what happened was the Commoner Revolution that started on April 15, 1775, fighting for our rights as Englishmen and women, that Commoner Revolution ended up getting hijacked. And it was hijacked by the ruling elite. I should say by the economic elite. And the economic elite realized that there was something they could gain out of this that they couldn't have under the British system. One of the things they wanted to do away with was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 effectively prevented the westward expansion of the colonies. And the reason that was a problem was the way we were set up right from the beginning was we would use tobacco, we would grow tobacco and cotton in the south. We would take the tobacco and cotton, we would send it to the north where they would then have the British come pick it up. They would bring the tobacco and cotton back to Britain where they would turn it into finished products. They would then take their finished products, put the ones that were coming back to be sold to us on ships, swing past Africa, grab some slaves, bring them back to the north, drop off the slaves, drop off the finished products. In the meantime, us Southerners, we would go up, we would get our finished products, we would get our slaves, and we would drop off our raw materials. And that was the relationship we had. And the problem with that was that tobacco and cotton destroyed the soil. Now, if we were responsible, what we would have done was we would have done crop rotations and we would have taken care of the soil. But that meant giving up all that amazing profit that we would have gotten from the cotton that we were growing and the tobacco we were growing. And because we had a whole continent, the mentality was grow as much cotton and tobacco as you can on the acreage that you have until you burn out the soil, move west, slaughter the Native Americans, turn that land into cotton and tobacco production. Native Americans farm, so you're taking their farmland, you're turning it over to cotton production, burn out the soil, move west, slaughter the Native Americans, burn out the soil, move west, slaughter the Native Americans. That's the origin of manifest destiny. It's not a good thing, it's a parasitical thing. It's like locusts going from one location to the other. We're wrecking the environment, using slave labor to do it. In the meantime, we're producing two products. One, cotton. Everybody loves cotton. Wonderful product, makes the world a better place. The other one, tobacco. Slowly killing your customers, right? So we're parasitical towards the soil, we're slaughtering the Native Americans, we're moving west, we're enslaving people or turning them into indentured servants, and we're killing our customers in the process. That's the birth of our country, right? That's the origins of the United States of America. As we go west, as we're slaughtering our way westward, we run out of land, effectively, which is ultimately why we're going to have to do the Civil War. But before we even get there, we run into the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which prevented the westward expansion from the Appalachian Mountains. So basically, it's just the original 13 colonies. We can't go into Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas because we can't go west to the Appalachian Mountains. We're stuck. We're stuck at Georgia. We're stuck at Virginia. There's no Kentucky or Tennessee option for us. And so, in the South, there's this sentiment of how do we break this? How do we get the British out of here so that we can go west? Because if we don't go west, we're done in the South. Because we've already burnt out the soil, and there's nothing else we can do except live on our inheritance. In the North, they want to start finishing the products themselves. They don't want to send them to England to be finished. They think, why don't we put the industry right here and we'll make the money right here. Not using slave labor, but using debt peonage. What you'll do is you'll bring in people from Europe, especially Irish, and you will hook them into the factory system, you will hook them into a debt that they'll never be able to pay because there are debtors' prisons. As a result, if they try to quit their job, they go to jail. It's not slavery, but it's the next best thing to it, effectively, because you're stuck in this state of perpetual work, 14 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, no benefits, no vacation, no sick time, and your wages are really horrid. By the way, it's one of the reasons why there are no movies set in the 19th century in the United States unless they're a Western or a Civil War flick. Go through it real quick. You can't name a movie, right? Except Gangs of New York, which is the exception of exceptions. And it kind of portrays the United States as not really that much of a pleasant place, but it's also 1862, so the Civil War is going on as a background to it. Life was so horrid, so nasty, so mean in the United States in the 19th century that Civil War movies are uplifting. That you'll enjoy yourself more watching soldiers shoot each other with .58 caliber rounds than you will if you see the day-to-day life of the average person in the United States at the time. This is where we're gonna go, but it's not where we're at the time of the revolution. What happens is this elite gets together at the Continental Congress and debates whether or not to side with the commoners. That's what the Continental Congress is about, is should the economic elite side with the commoners and do the revolution? And they decide they should side with the commoners, but not because they want the commoners to prevail so that we can get representation in Parliament, but so we can break away from Great Britain, so that we can create this debt peonage system in the North, so we can sustain slavery and tobacco and cotton production in the South by wiping out the Native Americans and moving west. All right, so that one's probably a fail. The French Revolution. French Revolution gets off to a weird start because it's the reverse of the American Revolution. The French Revolution starts out as a bourgeois revolution. It starts off with a bunch of economic elites going and creating the General Assembly. There is a protest, but at the end of the day, it's a bunch of economic elites. And the reason is they realize that we're onto something here. Think about the system under nobility, under a feudal system. That feudal lord is born to their position. Let's say you're a merchant. You don't like that feudal lord because he's impeding your commerce. He's impeding your trade. You want him gone. Well, the only way to get rid of him would be to try and get another feudal lord to kill him, good luck doing that because they kind of work together. It's like the whole myth of checks and balances. It would be like if I gave you all a test and then I passed the test back out to you, not to the same person who took the test, obviously, and then I said, okay, I'm going to leave the room, I want you to fairly grade it, and then I'll come back and I'll get them back. As soon as I step out the room, you need to be going, hey, if you give me an A, I'll give you an A, right? Because otherwise, what's wrong with you? Which is what the government does. So Americans go, ooh, checks and balances, genius idea, made up by a 5th grade teacher in the middle of the 19th century, not the founding fathers, because they would have never been so naive as to believe something so stupid. It doesn't make sense. You're going to let the government keep track of the government to make sure the government's doing the right thing? Like, what moron came up with that stupid idea? What? I have an idea. You know, like, wow. It'd be like turning prisons over to the inmates. Or insane asylums over to the inmates. I believe that was Sam Houston. Washington, D.C. is the only insane asylum where the inmates run the place. I think that was Sam Houston quote. Anyway, some prominent Texas politician. It might have been, anyway, I'm going with Sam Houston. If I'm proven wrong, I'm sorry. So, the French Revolution goes, oh my God, this is perfect. We'll elect the political elite. Because, since we have the money, we can always unseat them when we don't like them by simply giving the money to the opposition. So we'll only get stuck with the political elite for the length of their term, because as soon as we're sick of that bastard, we'll just go get another guy. And we can bribe them in the process. We'll call it campaign financing, which is just a form of legal bribery. Where I come, I give you $1 million, and then once you're elected, you're going to vote in Congress or in Parliament or the General Assembly or whatever the government is, the way I wanted you to, because if you don't, in 2 or 4 years or 6 years when you're up for re-election, I give the money to the opposition, right? This is the system that they created. Electoral republics aren't that great of an idea, it turns out, because at the end of the day, they allow the merchant class to be incredibly corrupt. Word gets to Haiti. Haiti was France's best colony. Haiti produced sugar like there was no tomorrow. Haiti, it's a tiny place, but it was unbelievably wealthy. It was actually probably the richest single colony, taking the American colonies are gone by that point. But even when the British still had the American colonies, if you took them as 13 independent states, Haiti was probably still better than, in terms of economic output, than Virginia. It was that wealthy. The slaves in Haiti are 500,000, 500,000. The mulattoes, the mixed white and black, were about 30,000. And under French law, they couldn't be made into slaves, so they were automatically free. And then the whites, the blanc, were about 20,000. So the free people in Haiti were 50,000, the slaves were 500,000. There was a 10-to-1 ratio. The slaves here, there's been a revolution in France without knowing any of the details. They basically played a game of telephone, and by the time they heard about it, they heard that it was a popular uprising and that the French people had taken over. And so the slaves decided to rebel in 1790. Well, word gets back to France that the slaves have liberated themselves in Haiti. And the average French person is going, well, if the slaves can do it, why can't us peasants do it? And so then there's a peasant and lower class, working class uprising in France in 1791, which is the part of the French Revolution that everybody remembers. That leads to the 5 years where they're guillotining people, which, by the way, I know is always portrayed negatively in our society, but was really, when you think about it, a pretty good period of time, right? The average person was inflicting justice on the ruling elite in a way that was particularly humane. You die instantly, right? There's no pain. There may be a little bit of suffering in the fact that you know what's coming, but when you think about it in terms of execution, but the French Revolution devolves. And one of the reasons it devolves is because at some point people start to see this as an opportunity. They're like, oh, I really hate my neighbors. Ha! And the next thing you know, the neighbors are being accused of being part nobility or having betrayed the revolution. And a bunch of innocent people also get guillotined in the process. And it leads to chaos. Now, the chaos is beautiful, but it's dangerous. The chaos leads to the French redoing their calendar. They changed the names of the months of the year. They changed They banned Catholicism. They got rid of Christianity. They outlawed it. They seized all the churches, and they called them temples of thinking. And they told people, go any day of the week, and we want you to have political and philosophical debates. And they said, these are works of art, these gorgeous churches, but we need to use them for something useful. Art changed. Everything was nude, right? Up until that point, everybody was always portrayed in clothing. But, Le Penseur by Rodin, the guy's nude. Everything is nude. All the clothes comes off. The music changes. The way people think changes. The world is flipped upside down by the French Revolution. It is truly a revolution. They changed their society. They even switched over to metric. They were the first state to do it. In the process, however, ultimately, the French elites start to gain a little bit of control, the new elites, the elites who have replaced the nobility, and they want order restored because they want to be able to carry on business as usual. And so they elect Napoleon Bonaparte to become a dictator with the intent that Napoleon Bonaparte will restore order to France. And he does it by waging war against the rest of Europe. And it does calm France down, but it also ends up being kind of a world war. It's definitely fought on multiple continents, the Napoleonic Wars. And France invades Spain, they invade the Netherlands, they invade Germany, they invade Italy, Austria, Prussia, Germany, Russia. They go all the way to Moscow, they capture Moscow. It's a disaster in the end, but for 17, 18 years, France is on this war rampage, and it ends with the restoration of the monarchy, right? The tragedy of tragedies is they go through all this revolution only to have the monarchy ultimately restored. The monarchy collapses, it's replaced by an empire. The empire collapses, it's replaced by a republic. Then there's, I think there's another empire, and then there's 3 more republics, and now France is on its 5th republic. And I think it had 2 empires, and there might have been 2 monarchical restorations. Yeah, there was 2, because there was anyway, there were 2, they were back to back. There were 2 monarchies. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It doesn't happen the way we wanted. 1848 is in many ways really the next big revolution. 1848 is this unbelievably world-shaking event because it happens across all of Europe and even happens in Brazil and Sri Lanka. So it took place on 3 continents. It happened in every European state except for Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Great Britain. And what it was many different things, but one of the key components to the 1848 revolution that's taking place in all these different states at the same time is that it was a workers' uprising. Workers literally captured the factories and seized the means of production. And they took them over and they said, these are ours, and all the benefits that we gain, all the product that's produced is going to benefit us and benefit us only. Ultimately, 1848 doesn't go the way people wanted to because the military from all these different countries comes in and crushes them. However, having said that, it kind of set the stage, right? The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. The seeds are planted for the German state in 1848. The German state the seeds were planted probably in 1700, but the idea of German nationalism was planted in 1848, and until that happened, there was no way to create the German state. The next, I should actually say there is a bright spot, and the bright spot was what happened in Sweden. Instead of the government reacting by slaughtering the people and taking back the factories, which is what happened in all the other European states, in Sweden the government comes and negotiates. And the brokered deal that they came up with was that Sweden would slowly transition into a socialist society. In 1871, there's another revolution. That revolution actually takes place because of a war. Prussia goes to war with France, and the reason Prussia goes to war with France is Prussia is trying to create Germany. And to do that, they needed to defeat France. They actually fought Sweden first, and then they fought Austria, and then they fought France. And as the Prussian army was pulling out of France and heading back to their newly created Germany that they're going to celebrate, right? Germany was founded in 1871. It's 95 years younger than the United States of America, just so that we're clear. As they're going back to celebrate the creation of their newly founded state, the French go, hold on, wait, can you come back? And the reason the French want the Germans to reinvade France because they're Germans now, not Prussians anymore. The reason they want the Germans to come reinvade France is because France has lost Paris. Paris has created the Paris Commune. The people of Paris seized Paris, and they took it over, and they reorganized it as a socialist state, and they were ruling it. And the French government was like, what do? We need our city back. This is our capital, it's our cultural capital, our political capital, it's our economic capital, it's the most important city. So they invite the German army back. The Germans are happy to do this. They come and they slaughter the city and they restore order and they hand it back to the French government, and then they withdraw back to Germany. Of course, the next revolution is the one that's going to shake the world again and seriously transform the world. And that revolution is the 1917 Russian Revolution. Now, the 1917 Russian Revolution, not to give you too much of the backdrop to it, and in fact, I'm not even going to talk so much about the Bolshevik part of it. I'm going to talk about the early part of it. And the reason is because I think it's the one that more applies to today than the other part. And this is what happened. Russia was in this horrible nightmarish event called World War I. They'd been fighting it for about 2.5 years by that point, and they were losing. And the country was falling apart. Food distribution systems had fallen apart. And there were bread lines everywhere. And it was, yes. And so, what happens is, there's a group of women, and they're in St. Petersburg, which is the Russian capital. And the women of St. Petersburg are in these lines. They've been there for days. It's March, but the Russian calendar was back a month. It was off by like 10 days. So it's February for Russia, but it's March for the rest of the world. But it's bitter cold in Russia in March, right? And so they're in this bread line. It's bitter cold. They're waiting. The day's going on. It's passing them by, and they realize there's no food at the end of this bread line. That they've been there for 8 hours in the cold, and they're going to be there till the next day because there's no food. So the women go, can't take it anymore. Our husbands and our brothers and our fathers are dead in the battlefield. There's no food to feed our children. We just can't take this anymore. And they begin marching towards the Winter Palace, the Tsar's Winter Palace. What kind of maniac puts his Winter Palace in St. Petersburg? You would think the Winter Palace would be like on the Black Sea, and the Summer Palace would be in St. Petersburg. But anyway, someday somebody will explain that nonsense to me. They start marching towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. You look like you have an answer for that. No? Okay. And as they're going, the Tsar does what he did every time before, and he calls out the Cossacks. And the Cossacks, of course, are these brutal, savage cavalry who happily slaughter everybody that they're told to slaughter. They love it. And usually when the Cossacks are called out, people turn around and run away screaming, so the Cossacks don't even have to look you in the eyes. They kill you from behind as you're running away. And the Cossacks line up. Their commander draws his saber, and the Russians are famous for going hurrah as they charge in, and it's this hurrah. And he lifts up his saber, and they do this when they start charging the women. And the women not only don't turn and run, like is normal. That's the normal, right? And then you get killed from behind. They charge the Cossacks. They're running through the square at the Cossacks. And the Cossacks are so baffled. They're so bewildered. They're so surprised at what they're seeing. They stop. They stop mid-charge, and they just look at these women charging them. And they're so surprised that they allow the women to run right up to them. And the Cossacks just, what are you doing? This isn't how it's done. And the women run up and they grab the reins and the bridles, the halters of these horses, and they pull themselves up to the Cossacks, and they yell, "You can't kill us, we're your mothers." And the Cossacks go, "You're right." And they join the women, and they storm the Winter Palace, and they capture it. And that's how the Russian Revolution started. The October Revolution is when the Bolsheviks then seize control, and that's another story. It's another story that needs to be told in detail to get the real benefit of it. But I want to make sure we got that thing going. Now, I'm going to tell you the bad end of it, because the bad end of it is what this is about at some level. And the bad end of it, of course, is sometime around 1924, one of the members of the Politburo, his name is Joseph Stalin, ends up starting to take control of the Soviet Union because Lenin has died, and he sees the opportunity. And it takes him about 4 years, sometime around 28, he's finished consolidating his power. And of course, that revolution doesn't go the way we wanted it to. So I'm going to jump ahead again. It's 1968. We've been in the civil rights movement for a while by 1968. But 1968, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement take a different turn. Up until 1968, the United States has been on fire. And, you know, there have been these demonstrations here and there. But by 1968, the level at which we're in a state of a revolution is at its peak. 1968 is sort of the high water mark of the 60s. And it goes global. It spreads to France. It spreads to different parts of Europe. It even jumps the Iron Curtain. It's taking place in different places around the world. It actually went global. 1968 went global. And in the act of going global, it didn't quite pull off anything like that could be considered a major coup or a major victory, but it transformed everywhere. It transformed France. It transformed Czechoslovakia. They had the Prague Spring in '68. And then, of course, it ultimately ends up fizzling. We're in another one of these 1968 moments. We're in another one of these global revolution moments. It didn't actually start this year. It actually started in December of 2010 in Tunisia. But in January of this year, the focus got switched to Egypt. And one of the reasons is because Egypt is just over 10 times larger than Tunisia. And so there's a little bit of a size issue here, and it's why Tunisia's sort of been eclipsed. Egypt also has a massive military. It's the most industrialized of the Arab states. I think it has the 10th largest military on earth. It has the largest rate of educated people in the Middle East, at least amongst the Arab population. It has the highest rate of college education, and it's actually one of Egypt's major industries is to create college-educated people and then export them overseas to work and then send back remittance payments to their families to help support their families. And it's actually, like, I think the third largest Egyptian industry now is creating smart people and then exporting them. So Egypt has this really weird effect on the rest of the world, and that is that it sparks a series of uprisings. The uprising here in Austin, Occupy Austin, is one of these sparked uprisings. It has gone global. The uprisings that we've seen now have taken place in 60 states around the world, including the United States, including the People's Republic of China, including just about every European state, Poland, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Great Britain. And Great Britain has actually seen a rather violent effect of this. The uprising in the summer that was portrayed as a bunch of looting, that wasn't a mass loot event, contrary to the way the news media portrayed it. It was a mass uprising. It was a popular uprising. It did result in property destruction, but at the end of the day, it was actually a popular uprising. It was very skillfully portrayed by the news media as being just a looting spree, but it wasn't. There's no doubt there was looting going on, but there's a crowd of 1,000 people and one person is over doing one thing wrong, and the news media cameras are focused on that one guy. It's that phenomenon. The tragedy of where we're at now is we're at a point where some decisions have to be made, and the decisions have to be made are how dedicated, how willing are we to go the whole rest of the way. Right now, the US government is cracking down on the Occupy movement across the United States. Right? We've had basically 10 days of systematic dismantling and really rather harsh treatment. Over the weekend, UC Davis, the campus police just gave us ammunition, right? I mean, they proved that we live in a police state, and they proved that this is a police state capable of creating really nasty violence. I mean, it wasn't like they were beating people to death with batons. They did that at Berkeley. I don't know that anybody died at Berkeley, but they were being beaten with batons. And then we saw, you know, the use of rubber bullets and those bean bags and the stun grenades at the Oakland events. So we've been seeing it, but there was nothing probably more emblematic of this police brutality than those two cops walking up and point blank hitting people with pepper spray. Egypt is now in stage 2 of its revolution. They are now in a mass revolt. They've captured Medan Tahrir, which is where the whole idea behind Occupy came from, right? What the Egyptians did on January, wait, let's see, the Egyptian revolution started, it ended on February 11th, it started January 18th. What they did on January 18th it started on January 25th, sorry. The Egyptian revolution started on January 25th. What they did on January 25th is they went to Medan Tahrir and they sat down in it and they refused to leave. They kept a permanent occupation going. And the reason they did this was they had noticed, the Egyptian protesters had noticed from their own events, they had general strikes in 2008 in Egypt, from the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, but also from events that had happened before. There was a popular uprising in Iran in 2009 called the Green Movement. The general strikes that Egypt did were in 2008, but they had also had strikes in Mahalla in 2006. The Egyptians had realized that when you protested in a location, and then afterwards went home, it allowed the cops to go invest that place. So when you would show up the next day to protest, you had a problem. You could either let the cops keep the location and go somewhere else to protest, which would be less desirable, or you had to do a street fight with the cops to get the location from them. So on January 25th, the plan in Egypt was, from the start, grab Medan Tahrir, hold it, and don't let the cops take it under any circumstance. Because once the cops have it, you're never getting back in there. And that's what they did for 18 days. Now, they did it because they had numbers. They had numbers like nothing we've ever seen in the United States. I mean, on several occasions, they had 1 million people in the streets in Cairo. Right? That's going to be really tough for us to ever replicate here. Not because we don't have the people, but because we probably don't have the will, at least at this point. And people are very afraid. And in Egypt, they had a right to be afraid there too. In that 18 days, 850 Egyptians were killed, thousands were wounded, and thousands were imprisoned. The government responded with force, and Egyptians suffered. Right? Businesses were damaged, property was destroyed, people were injured. It's hard to compete with that. But at the end of the day, they kind of won. They didn't fully win. I think that's where people get a little confused about revolution. Revolution isn't an event that starts and then ends. It's finding the exact moment it started is probably actually really hard. Like I just got through telling you, there were general strikes in 2008. And actually, they had demonstrations on January 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of this year. And then on the 25th, the revolution started. But in a way, you could count January 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. But then the original organizing took place in 2006. You know, and then if you want to, you can keep going back and back. You can go back to the 1952 Egyptian Revolution, which inspired, at some level, the revolution that happened in 2011. You can go back to the 1919 Egyptian Revolution, which inspired the 1952 revolution, right? So revolutions are messy because it's hard to say when they start, and it's also difficult to know when they end because they're an ongoing process. All they did on February 11 was overthrow Hosni Mubarak. Then the military assumed control of Egypt. And people have put up with that until about 3 or 4 days ago, when the Egyptian people went back to Medan Tahrir and captured the square again. And they've been in the thousands. They haven't had the numbers that they had back in January and February. They were in the tens of thousands at the low points. They would go from tens of thousands to millions. Like they would fluctuate from day to day. Usually it was Fridays that they would get to the million mark. What was that? They blew up a cop car in Egypt? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They decreased
say violence, I would say.
It's been very violent today, and actually also yesterday. There have been these ongoing street battles. If you want, there's amazing film footage of it. BBC's where I've been getting most of my film footage. And they're now not fighting the police. In round one, which was in January and February, the Egyptians were fighting the police. And they defeated the police and they put the police down. This time they're actually fighting the Egyptian army. And the reason they're fighting the Egyptian army is because they don't want to have fought a revolution so that the army can take over. That's the danger with every revolution. At some point you have to make a compromise, most likely, with the power elites. The problem is what kind of a compromise are you willing to make? My fear for the Occupy movement is that it'll fizzle, and one of the reasons I think it'll fizzle is people are going to think, well, we got a bunch of people to divest from banks, we got the banks to back down from their monthly debit card fees, and we're going to claim that's a win, and we're going to walk away. Because one of the things that we maybe failed to do with the Occupy movement is get those guys to stop driving by and join us. That life is as usual has actually gone on for most people. That life as usual. Get out of your car. Well, I mean, but you got to convince them to get out. You can't force them to get out. And this is where we're stuck. This is where the chances of a real American revolution. And I'm not necessarily talking about a Soviet-style revolution, where we're gonna overthrow the powers that be and replace them. Even if it's a 1960-style revolution where we're just gonna make major changes, but the ruling elite are gonna stay intact. The only way to even get there is we've got to get more people to get involved. And I don't know how to get the more people to get involved except to make things get worse. There's no doubt that the reason why the government wants you to vote is because you legitimize the government, right? Because the whole idea behind an election, there's this weird thing in the United States where people will say, if you didn't vote, you can't complain. It's actually the exact opposite. Because by voting, you accept the outcome. Whether the outcome was the one you wanted or the other outcome, by voting, you are agreeing to the outcome. By not voting, you're effectively saying, I don't agree to the outcome because I don't approve of the outcome. So if everybody stopped voting, so if you had 0% voter turnout, there would definitely be a very serious legitimacy crisis. Having said that, we're already at 50% voter turnout. Now, the last two elections, we've seen a rise in the voter turnout, and we've been hovering, I think, 53 and 55%, 53 in 2004 and 55 in 2008. There's a good chance we'll see decent voter turnout for US standards in 2012, and it'll probably be, it might be 53-ish is my guess, in that area. Now, that's good for US standards. It's actually catastrophic for most societies. In the Netherlands, I'm trying to remember the years. I want to say 2006. There was the Srebrenica massacre, and not to get into all of that, but the Dutch government resigned 9 months after coming into power for a scandal that had happened 10 years earlier in Yugoslavia that the UN had actually done, but with Dutch forces. And so the Dutch government, even though there were probably some people from the previous government from 10 years earlier in that Dutch government, the Dutch government resigned in protest for the actions of the previous Dutch government. Imagine that, politicians acting like they're responsible for previous governments. But it meant that the Dutch had to have an immediate election to create a new government. They had the election, and they had right around 80% voter turnout. At 80% voter turnout, there was a question asked in the Netherlands. Is this a legitimate election? Is this government legitimate? Are we in the midst of a constitutional crisis? Because how can this government be legitimate with only 80% voter turnout? When the Dutch are used to 95% voter turnout. And the reason it happened was people were just sick of voting. They didn't turn out. They had voter fatigue. And they were just like, whatever, I don't care. We know that our system is designed so that you have to pick between two guys that are effectively picked by the ruling elite. You get your choice. You can get the mild version or the jerk version, but that's it. You're still going to get It's
A jerk version.
you're still at the end of the day getting the guy that the elites have picked for you. So it's like a beauty contest, but you already know who the two contestants at the end are going to be, right? I think in many ways, picking Miss America is a much more rigorous, much more thorough, much more complex process than picking our president. Because there's another aspect to all of this that makes it kind of insane, and that's the way the press covers elections. The press covers elections as a horse race rather than talking about the issues. Watch the next time you hear the Republican primaries being talked about, and wait for, don't do a debate. I'm talking about when the journalists are actually, the debates will just confuse you at some level unless they start punching each other, which would be fun. Because they lie and they change their position. Like if you were to go back 8 years ago and talk to Mitt Romney, he had Romney Care, right? He was pro-choice, he was for civil unions, he was for gays in the military, and now he's reversed on everything. And of course, the reason is because he's trying to get the Tea Party vote. So at the end of the day, these guys are just a bunch of liars who don't care about anything, they don't believe in it. But the press doesn't focus on those issues. The press doesn't tell you what Romney stands for. The press doesn't debate the difference between Perry and Romney. It just tells you the difference. It says, oh, the Tea Partiers like Perry better than they like Romney. But it doesn't tell you why. And so, the media drops the ball on the conversation. The election system is designed really not to take you into consideration. And then we have a two-party system that's designed to sustain the ruling elites. So whether you're voting for Romney, I'll tell you right now, it's going to be Romney and Obama. Whether you're voting for Romney, watch I be wrong. No! The shame! I'm pretty sure it's Romney and Obama. And I'll even go so far as to say, unless something really crazy happens between now and then, I bet Obama wins. But even if you vote for Obama or you vote for Romney, it doesn't matter. They're the same guy. They're just in a different party. And at the end of the day, they're both really moderate. They're both pretty close to the middle. They both support some sort of healthcare reform. You know, they're not radicals. They're not going to make any major changes. Obama might have wanted to, but he couldn't. And the reason he couldn't was people wouldn't take to the streets. And the only way to make changes in a society like ours is people have to go to the streets. And then politicians who want to make those changes have the ability to make them because they have the people's backing. If the people are sitting at home watching TV, there's nothing those politicians can do. So even if you believed Obama was sincere, which is unlikely, he never had a chance to execute those changes that he promised because you didn't make it. Obama, he sounded a little sympathetic.
Well, there's a video called I Am Not Moving on YouTube. It's super awesome, and it kind of draws the parallels between the revolution that happened in Egypt and in all of the other countries very recently, and like what's going on now. And Hillary and Obama were like so supportive of those movements in other places, of course. And they were also going up for election, so they were like, I implore you to be sympathetic and support these people that are actually taking a stand for their rights. And so now we're doing it, and we're seeing the same kind of response, and it's just very interesting because, I mean, if he was really legitimate in what he said, then he should be sympathetic to what we're doing. He was super sympathetic for them.
The people of the Middle East, like people everywhere, are seeking a chance to contribute and to have a role in the decisions that will shape their lives. Leaders need to respond to these aspirations and to help build that better future for all. They need to view civil society as their partner, not as a threat.
I want to take this opportunity to update the American people about the situation in Libya. Last month, protesters took to the streets across the country to demand their universal rights and a government that is accountable to them and responsive to their aspirations. But they were met with an iron fist.
Freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press
Come here, do you want to get arrested or no?
are pillars of an open and inclusive society. There is a clear responsibility by the Egyptian government to hold accountable those responsible for these attacks.
For months, the Iranian people have sought nothing more than to exercise their universal rights. We call upon the Iranian government to abide by the international obligations that it has to respect the rights of its own people. We call for the immediate release of all who have been unjustly detained. And I'm confident that history will be on the side of those who seek justice.
I will not stand by and just watch. I will not do it. So take me to jail right now, because I will not. After all that my parents gave me, I can do one thing for them and tell them that I would rather die than be quiet and watch everything that they worked for go away.
When all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual.
I'm not moving. I'm not moving. And I'm not moving. I'm a law student at George Washington University, and I'm not moving. I will go to jail tonight because it's not right.
We are against violence, and we would call to account the Iranian government that is once again using its security forces and resorting to violence to prevent the free expression of ideas from their own people.
Instead of respecting the rights of his own people, Gaddafi chose the path of brutal suppression. Innocent civilians were imprisoned.
I have not been read my rights. I have not been told why I'm being detained.
We want to know the people who are in there. We want to know all their names, what they're being charged with.
And in some cases beaten.
You can't breathe, officer. Please get off his neck.
I need my inhaler.
A campaign of intimidation and repression began.
It is the responsibility of the government of Libya to respect the universal rights of their own people, including their right to free expression and assembly.
What's his badge number? What is his badge number?
Demonstrators have been beaten, attacked. It is absolutely clear that the Syrian government is running out of time.
Each new depiction of the abuses of the police on the First Amendment, the more people will show up here in New York City, and the more waves of occupation will spread across this country. And you should be proud of that, police, because you are participating in our media publicity campaign.
It's young people who've been at the forefront.
A new generation. Your generation, who want their voices to be heard.
And you bring up an excellent observation. I mean, that's the same thing with the London uprising in summer. You know, here's Great Britain bombing Libya into submission because they want to support the Libyan revolution, and they have an uprising, and then they're like arresting people. Instead of going, why are we having, it's the same exact thing. It's exactly the same thing, and it's the level of hypocrisy that we're operating underneath. There's no difference between the London uprising and the Libyan uprising, other than the London uprising was a lot less well armed, and there wasn't a bunch of European countries bombing London while it was going on.
Public ability through technology. As technology diffuses into society, we have smartphones, we have robotics, things like this. How do you see that changing the playing field of social structure?
I mean, I think it's totally already changed the playing field of social structure. For example, I have a feeling that people's speaking abilities compared to 15 years ago are greatly reduced. And I think part of that is because we spend so much time typing or texting our replies to each other that we're losing the skill of being able to talk to each other, which is really a shame, because at a core level, speech is so much more complex that typing is very primitive. I mean, you think about it, I bet if you think of Australopithecus, you know, early Australopithecines in the African veld, you know, they were, you know, maybe 4.5 feet tall and completely covered in hair and much smaller brain, and we were not at the top of the food chain. We were very much in the middle of the food chain, and we're out without the speaking capabilities that we have now, without the tongue and the larynx fully developed. We probably did a lot of signing, and we probably did a lot of drawing in the dirt to communicate with each other. And so in a way, by relying so heavily on texting and messaging, we've reduced ourselves to where we were. I feel the rain coming. We've reduced ourselves to where we were a million years ago. And so my fear is that we are digressing, even though we're also still evolving.
First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. Then you win.
I heard them say the revolution won't be televised. Al Jazeera proved them wrong. Twitter has them paralyzed.